Welcome back to Proxam, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about the almighty Craftworld Eldar Wraithlord and answering the question, are they competitive? So I believe that Wraithlords are very good, and I've done a couple of videos here and there covering Wraith units and Wraithlords in the past. But I did want to cover them in Arks of Omen because I think they have one distinct advantage in Arks of Omen that they really didn't have before. And that's basically the fact that you can take them more easily now due to the detachment rules being eased a little bit. So reasons that a lot of people really didn't take them before is because their elite slots were typically filled with things like Howling Banshees and Striking Scorpions and, of course, Dire Avengers. There was just really no room to take them in a battalion detachment. But with the Arks of Omen detachment, if you do want to go heavy into elites, you have the option of taking up to 6 elite choices. And I think this really opens up the Wraithlord to more consideration. On top of that, I've done a few videos here and there on Wraith units and Wraithlords in particular on this channel. And I have to say, Wraithlords are actually a very strong unit that I think a lot of people underestimate because of its cost. And the reason why is something I'll go into in the video. But essentially, I think they've been really overlooked and in a lot of ways underestimated. So let's go ahead and jump right into the video and talk about the Craftworld Eldar Wraithlord. And like always, before we begin, we're going to do a quick overview of the video. We're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of the Wraithlord. We're going to be looking at which Craftworld bonuses and builds are the best. We're going to be talking about the pros and cons of the Wraithlord, of course. And lastly, are Wraithlords competitive, and why have they not been seen in much tournament play? So that's something that we really haven't seen much. We really haven't seen much of any builds, including Wraithlords, in pretty much any winning tournament list. And in this video, we will talk about why that is. All right, so looking at the stats of the Wraithlord, it comes in at 100 points. And for that, you get something with movement 8, which is pretty solid speed for a Wraith unit. Weapon skill, ballistic skill 3. It has strength 7 and toughness 8, which is exceptional. Strength 8 is a very good threshold because it basically means that strength 4 weapons wound you on 6s. And honestly, pretty solid offensive stats. It has 4 attacks, which is not bad. A 3+ save, which is pretty average for Wraith units. And of course, it also has 9 wounds. The weird thing, of course, is its leadership, which is 9, which I believe is actually 1 less than Wraithguard units, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me why they did this, but hey, whatever, right? It rarely comes into play, so it's not really that important. As for the weapons it can take either 2 flamers or 2 shuriken catapults. We'll talk about the shuriken catapults in a second, but the flamers are great at clearing infantry at close range. They auto-hit, and they do D6 attacks apiece. So these are pretty awesome, and they're pretty good in close combat too, especially against chaff units and maybe units that are a little bit harder to hit. The Eldari missile launcher, on the other hand, is kind of decent, but it really loses in efficiency to both the scatter laser and bright lance against its respective targets. So the sunburst type is a blast, which only has strength 4, AP -1, and damage 1. It does have the better range, but you're rarely going to need that extra 12 inches on something like a Wraithlord. And for the star shot, it just does much worse damage than the bright lance against heavy targets. And then, of course, we do have the bright lance. So the bright lance is a pretty popular pick on a Wraithlord. It's a solid anti-large tool with high AP and damage and has good synergy with a lot of the Craftworld traits. If you're running Uthway, right, you get to reroll a wound with it. If you're running Beal-Tan, you get to reroll a hit with it. So this is a very popular weapon to use on a Wraithlord. We also have the Ghost Glaive, which turns the Wraithlord into an absolute beast in close combat and allows it to smash through multiple unit types. So the Crushing Strike gives it strength 9, AP -4, and damage D3+3. This makes it a monster against heavy targets. And the Sweeping Blow makes it pretty good against light infantry or just basically 2-wound infantry that is more numerous, right? Things like regular Space Marines and stuff like that. And honestly, 8 attacks against pretty much any unit that doesn't have a really high armor save is going to be pretty deadly, right? Especially with the loss of Armor of Contempt, you can really slice through Assault Marines, slice through regular Primaris, and do a really good amount of damage to other units as well. I've actually had a little bit of success using this against knobs and things like that because they do have 2 wounds, they have less of a save in general, and because this thing has such a high strength, at strength 7, he's usually wounding knobs on a 3+, so that's always useful as well. As for its other ranged weapons, we have the Scatter Laser, which is a best-in-class light infantry weapon, great at clearing out light infantry with a low armor save and chaff units that are meant for screening. The Shuriken Cannon also has very good damage versus armored infantry at range, so very good against things like, your regular Space Marine, Sister of Battle, and things like that. Of course, has damage 2, so is better used against basically models with 2 wounds. So to be honest, most Sisters units wouldn't be that great of an option for this to shoot at, but again, it does have a little bit of a higher AP value as well, so that does help. Also, we have the Shuriken Catapult, which is the base weapon that it can get on its wrists, and they're decent base weapons with good AP. No complaints there, pretty decent. Basically gives it as much shots as a Windrider Jetbike. Now, lastly, we have the Star Cannon, and of course the Wraithbone Fist. So the Star Cannon is kind of awkward, I think. It's kind of an awkward weapon because it's really only good against certain high value, high armor targets, things like Custodes and things like that. So if you're going against an army of Custodians, well, to be honest with you, this thing is pretty decent, right? It basically almost can kill a model every shot. Custodes will still get a save against this, but it'll usually be a 5+ or a 6+ save. So pretty decent overall, but doesn't have a lot of armies that it's good against actually. So again, Grey Knights it's good against because Grey Knights are expensive. So this makes sense to have a weapon like this that can do consistent high AP damage to those models. Against Custodes, again, Custodes are a very expensive army, so this thing makes sense. But pretty much against any other army out there, it's going to struggle to be efficient. So, for example, you take it against anything non-Space Marine elite. And when I mean Space Marine elite, I'm not talking about your normal Space Marine army. I'm talking about your elite Space Marine armies. I'm talking about things that are very high in points, right? Because they have a lot of special rules and a lot of cool weapons and stuff like that, like Grey Knights and Custodes. But the trade-off is that they're more expensive. And I can kind of probably see a Custode nerf coming on, just a little bit of one, maybe a points increase on a couple of their units or something like that. I don't know. We'll see. The new, basically, data slate changes are going to be coming in April. So we have that to look forward to. So we'll kind of see if that makes the Star Cannon any more viable against certain armies. But, you know, again, we'll see. Star Cannons really haven't been taken that much because they're kind of in an awkward place. As for the Wraithbone Fists, they're pretty decent weapons, honestly, for basically free, right? You get them base. They have Strength User, which is going to be 7, AP -3, which isn't really that bad, to be honest with you, for being free again, and Damage 3. So when it's all said and done, if you don't take out the Ghostglaive, the Wraithlord still has some pretty decent combat presence. It's just that most of the time you're going to want that Ghostglaive because it just does so much more damage to hard targets, and it just does so much more damage to infantry that has, 2 wounds that it can just sweep away. And when we get to its special rules, the Wraithlord has surprisingly few special rules. It basically just has one, which is the Wraithbone Form, reduces all damage taken by attacks by 1. So this does make the Wraithlord more durable, but to be honest with you, it just makes it more durable against damage 2 weapons and damage 3 weapons. The reason why I say that is because against things like Meltas, Last Cannons, and weapons that have a high damage in their profile, like basically all your heavy anti-tank weapons, this thing is going to go down fairly quickly. It only has 9 wounds. A couple Last Cannons that go through, that hit and wound, are basically going to put this thing down pretty easily. And that's why a lot of people are kind of turned off by Wraithlords as well, because these guys are supposed to be this durable unit. And on paper, they're just not really that durable against the heavy weapons that are going to be targeting them. Even with Toughness 8, a lot of weapons out there like Last Cannons that are very common in Space Marine armies are going to be wounding them on 3s. So, a lot of people kind of tune them out. But, they are more durable against light infantry fire. Anything with damage 2, they're very good, or damage 3, they're very good because of this special rule. And not for nothing, but it also has the core keyword, so it can benefit from core-specific buffs and abilities. Okay, so which Craftworld bonuses work best with Wraithlords? So this is a question that a lot of people ask when they pick up the Combat Patrol is, what Craftworld should I use and what's best with Wraithlords? So believe it or not, I think everybody knows this by now, so it's pretty common knowledge among Eldar players, but Uthway is obviously the best choice for a Wraithlord. And the reason why is because you get a lot of bonuses that all directly impact Wraithlords and basically cover a lot of the weaknesses that Wraithlords have against high impact attacks. So Wraithlords, for one, don't have an invulnerable save. So the Uthway trait gives you a 6+ invulnerable save, and that really synergizes well with Strands of Fate. Now, a 6+ really isn't that good on its face value, right? Because most of the time, you're not going to be able to roll a 6 if somebody is shooting last cannons at you. There's only a 1 in 6 chance you're going to do that. But with Strands of Fate, it gives you an autosave against a lot of heavy weapons out there. Now, this is a little bit misleading, right? And the reason why is because against a last cannon, you're still going to get a 6+ armor save. So that 6+ invulnerable save is not going to really do a lot. Where this does come in real handy, though, is against Melta weapons. Against Melta weapons, which have AP4, a Wraithlord won't get a save. But if you have, again, the 6+ invul save, you can use Strands of Fate to save those. So even though it might not be that good against AP3 weapons, against AP4 weapons, it's extremely effective and it's extremely, needed for the Wraithlord to survive against those attacks. It also has a 5+ ignores mortal wounds, which is also pretty good, right? If you're going against something like Thousand Suns or something, an army that can just pour out a lot of mortal wounds, this is a very good ability. 5+ ignores mortal wounds will make it much tougher to deal with. And basically, the enemy army is going to have to pour 33% more damage into the Wraithlord to be able to bring it down with mortal wounds. It also gets a reroll to wound, which is really helpful if you're using things like the Bright Lance. I mean, it's good on any weapon, to be honest with you, because the Wraithlord has high impact weapons usually. Bright Lance, Scatter Laser, things like that. Things that you can, basically have a good chance of getting the wound roll on if you reroll it. So that's always useful as well. I also like some of the far-flung Craftworld traits. So there's a lot of them that benefit Wraithlords. I think some of the best ones, though, are the Wrath of the Dead, which gives it heroic intervention. And this is awesome, because if you have a unit of D cannons in the back and you're using a Wraithlord to protect them, having the ability to heroically intervene and get attacks off against a unit that's basically going after the D cannons is extremely important and effective. And it basically means you do not have to waste a turn the next turn charging in the Wraithlord at that unit, which honestly you do want to protect your D-cannon, so that's something you would do anyway, right? That's very good. Warding runes is also very good for the same reasons I mentioned before. For Uthway, 6+ invulnerable save and 5+ ignores mortals is very effective. Masters of Concealment or the Elatar Craftworld are very good because of the light cover outside of 12 inches that they give the Wraithlord, which again kind of gives the same effect as the Strands of Fate, the Uthway trait for the 6+ invulnerable save, because that means AP -4 weapons outside of 12 inches will be a little bit harder to use because of that Strands of Fate, so it'll make it more durable. And of course, the Ynnari. So the Ynnari is very good with the Wraithlord. The reason why is because you have access to a 4+ invulnerable save via the Shield of Ynid. You also get the ability to always strike first, which I think is probably one of the best army-wide abilities in the game, and it's why Ynnari is, in combination with the Yncarne, is so powerful, really. It's just absolutely monstrous on a Wraithlord, and here's the reason. Basically, Wraithlords have the ability, unlike other units in our army, well, aside from Wraith units, to stay in combat for multiple turns, right? For multiple rounds, because they are, in fact, pretty tough, especially in close combat when they can't be shot at. I mean, even against Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators, for the most part, they can pretty much survive at least one round. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. No, they can't, right? Terminators are insane, especially Deathwing. They have a lot of attacks. They can get psychic powers to reroll hits and wounds and stuff like that. Yeah, that's definitely true. But, not everybody is Dark Angels, and pretty much everybody in the meta right now, no matter if they're Dark Angels or not, are running Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators. So if you charge this thing into a unit of 5 of them, you can definitely survive at least one turn of combat between the damage 1 and the toughness 8. And of course, they will get a 6-up save against those attacks because Thunderhammers... Well, actually, no, I think they'll get a 5+ save, because Thunderhammers only have AP -2. So Wraithlords are actually pretty durable against those weapons. So on average dice rolls, Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators will actually not really be able to kill this guy if you do the math correctly. So if you do the math, you'll get about 15 attacks out of that unit of Terminators. They hit on 3s, so only 10 of those are going to hit. And I'm assuming there's no buffs on the unit, obviously. But about 10 of them will hit, 5 of them will wound. You'll probably save about 2 of them. 3 will go through, 6 wounds will be dealt to the Wraithlord. So you're going to have 3 wounds left, and because the Wraithlord does not get bracketed, you are going to be tacking at full strength. And of course, if you charge in, that's assuming you didn't kill any Terminators on the charge, which you should, right? Then in the next round, you will proc the Always Strike First ability, right? So during your opponent's turn, unless they could fight with that unit first, obviously, and negate it. But if they have to fight multiple important combats, your Wraithlord might get the chance to strike again. So having the ability to always strike first is a pretty decent tool to have. Now, something I didn't mention in this list was Children of the Open Skies. I also think Children of the Open Skies is pretty decent because it gives Wraithlords an extra movement, which is important. Even though they do have movement 8, they're kind of slow, to be honest with you, and they don't advance well. So having the ability to basically advance as well as move a little farther is a really helpful bonus for the Wraithlord. Again, I don't think it's the best bonus for a Wraithlord, but I do think it's helpful. Okay, so as for the Wraithlord builds, I think there's 3 that basically stand out to me as the best. Now, just a quick disclaimer. Some people have asked me in the past, do you think it's worth mixing weapons, right? Using a scatter laser and a bright lance, or a missile launcher and a scatter laser, or, any combination of those, right? And yes, I think there is some merit to having mixed weapons. I'm just not a big fan, personally. And the reason why is because I think Wraithlords are already a pretty versatile weapon platform that can do a lot of different things, right? They're good against a lot of different targets already because of their basically combat ability and the fact that they can have multiple different types of heavy weapons. So in my opinion, now this is again just my opinion, some people are free to disagree with me, but in my opinion, it's better to stick with one weapon type and make the Wraithlord better at dealing with those targets. But again, like I said, there's nothing terribly wrong with that. I'm just not really a fan of doing it myself. So if you need a Wraithlord that can do a little bit of everything, you want it to have a little bit of anti-infantry, you want it to have a little bit of anti-tank, then you'll probably want to go with something like a Bright Lance and a Scatter Laser. But if you want it to be more efficient against one type of target, then you're going to want to give it the same weapon. So my favorite builds with the Wraithlord are the Firestorm, the Sniper, and the Avenger. So the first build I like to call the Firestorm. It's equipped with 2 Scatter Lasers, 2 Flamers, and the Ghostglaive, coming in at 135 points. And this is a great build for clearing light infantry and screening chaff. So a lot of times you might find some opponents want to engage you and just tie you up in close combat, right? They want to get after your D cannons in the back or whatever you have in the backfield, your war walkers. They just want to throw units into them and basically just tie them up so they can't shoot at the rest of your army, right? There's a lot of armies that are good at doing this with things like Termagants, Hormagons, stuff like that, right? So that can really mess up your plans for a turn. I mean, D cannons that are engaged for even one turn of close combat lose a significant amount of their value. So having a Wraithlord nearby that can clear those models out is very good. So it also has really powerful close combat to follow up through tough targets. So not only can it deal with chaff units like Gaunts and Imperial Guardsmen and things like that with its 2 Flamers and 2 Scatter Lasers, but it's also very effective at killing tough targets with the Ghostglaive in close combat. So if an opponent wants to drop a tough target in your backfield via deep strike or via reserve or something like that, and maybe you haven't screened it out properly, or didn't have the chance to screen it out, a Wraithlord can also do some pretty big hurt in close combat. And the next build we have is the Sniper. So the Sniper is equipped with 2 Bright Lances, 2 Shuriken Catapults, and the Ghostglaive coming in at 155 points. So this is a solid long-range anti-large damage Wraithlord, and of course, it's on a very durable platform. So even though you get more value for the Bright Lances out of things like Warwalkers are of course cheaper. You can pretty much afford 2 Warwalkers for every Sniper Wraithlord. Warwalkers are arguably much easier to kill than the Wraithlord is. In addition, the Wraithlord is a powerful close combat unit that can act as a defensive tool as well. So the Ghostglaive, of course, is a big deterrent to large targets and also very effective at cracking open hard targets as well. So yes, the Bright Lances are going to be, less cost effective than other units, but because it's on a very durable and close combat oriented platform, you're getting a lot more out of the Wraithlord than just the Bright Lances. And then lastly, we have the Avenger. So this is equipped with 2 Shuriken Cannons, 2 Shuriken Catapults, and a Ghostglaive coming in at 135 points. This is a versatile platform that can do solid damage against armored infantry and much more with Hail of Doom. So I actually like this thing in Hail of Doom. I ran one of these in a Hail of Doom list at the very beginning of the edition, and I found this extremely effective at dealing with armored targets. And of course, because it's a Wraithlord and has the Ghostglaive, it's also very good in close combat and has a big board presence. And again, this is going to make it a little bit more vulnerable against certain opponents, but you just kind of have to gauge that well. And truly, I do think this is a Wraithlord build that is basically perfect for Hail of Doom lists. So if your Hail of Doom list is missing a mid-board presence or missing a kind of defensive tool in it, consider this. It's really effective. Honestly, and obviously I did think it was a little bit better when you could give it things like superior shurikens on top of that, but since the Hail of Doom nerf, you can't really do that. I still think it's a pretty good build though for those, armies to take. Now, the other thing I like about this build is that it's pretty cheap and it can benefit from the Bladestorm ability. So if you do take this in an army that maybe doesn't utilize that many shuriken units, like if you're taking it outside of Hail of Doom, it's actually pretty decent with Bladestorm and can get a couple of extra attacks off if you use that stratagem. It doesn't seem that great on paper, right? But if you also give it something like Guide and Low Point games, it can actually generate quite a few extra attacks, right? And again, I think this is only really relevant in small point games or at the end of a game maybe, where, you don't have a large target to cast Guide on, but it's still pretty effective, I think, for what it can do. Okay, so let's talk about the pros of the Wraithlord. So one of the biggest pros, I think, is that it's really durable against Strength 4 or lower weapons because of its Toughness 8. Strength 4 or lower weapons are going to be wounding on 6s, which means Wraithlords are going to survive those attacks very well. It has a variety of heavy weapons to choose from, making it a very versatile tool in your army. It also has extremely powerful close combat with the Ghostglaive. So obviously the Ghostglaive is a very powerful weapon, and this allows the Wraithlord to become really effective against a numerous amount of targets in your opponent's army. And it's only 15 points, so I think it's a really good investment to have on a Wraithlord. Also, pretty tough for its cost. So it is Toughness 8 and has -1 damage, which make it extremely durable against a lot of targets. And of course, its stats don't degrade, which is really good. That means if you have a Wraithlord with even 1 wound left, it's going to be fighting at full potential. And lastly, it is a core unit, so it can benefit from certain buffs and abilities. It can be targeted with things like psychic powers, like Fortune, if you do have it, Shield of Need, if you do have it. It can also be targeted with buffs that are auras, like the Autarch buff that allows for rerolls of 1 to core units and stuff like that. So pretty good keyword to have, honestly. However, the Wraithlord does have some cons, and we would be kind of amiss not to talk about them. So the heavy weapon damage, when factored alone, is less cost effective than other options. So if you're comparing its heavy weapon damage to Vipers, right, or to Warwalkers, it's less cost effective. For example, you can get 2 Warwalkers with Bright Lances for the same cost as a Wraithlord with 2 Bright Lances. So again, you're getting double the firepower with those Warwalkers. So it's not very cost effective in terms of heavy weapon damage when compared to those other units. It also dies quickly to high damage attacks. So yes, if you are running Uthway, this can be mitigated a lot with that 6+ invulnerable save against things like Meltas. But, against weapons that are going to have more than 1 or 2 attacks. So yes, it can survive a couple of Meltas because you have Strands of Fate. And of course, you have a high toughness, so only half of the Melta shots that are going to hit are going to go through. But again, if you're not getting a save against that, or you're only getting a 6+, this thing can go down very quickly. The other thing about the Wraithlord that you guys have to know is that its melee damage, when factored alone, also is much less cost effective than other options. And this is why a lot of people, when they look at the Wraithlord and they think, well, it's really good in combat, but I'd probably rather have a unit of Striking Scorpions. Or I'd rather have a unit of Howling Banshees, right? Because those units are much better in combat damage-wise than the Wraithlord is. And yes, that is true, and I would argue that the strength of the Wraithlord doesn't lie in how much combat damage it can do, but how versatile it is and how much of a defensive tool it can be. But it does have much less cost-effective damage than those other options. And lastly, it has no special deployment and it's impossible to transport. So it's very hard to get this thing to the mid-board on one single turn. Because of that, it only has movement 8. So even if you start on the deployment line, it's very hard to get into your enemy's deployment zone or, the center of the field where it needs to be in the late game because of its slow movement. You can't transport it because it's a monster. And it has no good way besides strategic reserve of being deployed except in your own deployment zone, which isn't a terrible thing by any stretch of the imagination. But normally units that we do deploy on the field are either very fast and can move to objectives quickly and engage targets quickly, or, they're things like D cannons, which are really not going to move that much anyway, and you're probably just going to shoot or use Fire and Fade on. So that's why you really don't see Wraithlords in a lot of more mobile and, more offensive lists. And you kind of see them considered more in, defensive style lists. So basically, let's now answer the question. Are Wraithlords competitive and why have they not seen much tournament play? So I think that although Wraithlords are very good, ultra competitive lists usually try to push the limits in one direction. And Wraithlords honestly just don't really fit neatly into any one category. So they're not really the best in class close combat damage. They're not the best in class range damage. They're tough, but they're not the toughest unit in the army. They don't have access to things like battle focus either. So they're kind of in this odd middle ground spot. And basically, depending on what you need in a list, there will always be a more cost-effective option in terms of damage, both in range and melee. And that's why I think it really doesn't fit well into a lot of ultra-competitive lists that you see in tournaments. However, despite their lack of presence in ultra-competitive scenes, I do think Wraithlords are very effective and can be competitive if they're used correctly. So they're a very good defensive tool, and I've said this many times on both the channel and just in my own gaming group. If used defensively and smartly, I think Wraithlords can actually do very well for themselves. Especially in the late game when there's not a lot left on the table. If you still have a Wraithlord around, you can kind of do whatever you want, right? Melta weapons are probably going to be mostly dead. Anti-tank weapons are probably mostly going to be offline. And Wraithlords at that point can absolutely stomp the battlefield in turns 4 and 5. And I think that's where Wraithlords really shine through the best, is turns 4 and 5, you play them conservatively in the first couple of turns. Maybe you come out for a shot here and there in the backfield, and then you kind of use them in the late game to bully opponents, take objectives, and just run the battlefield from there. And if your opponent has a really aggressive list, Wraithlords are a very good tool for defending things like D cannons and stuff like that in the backfield and giving your opponents a second thought into whether or not they should go in, because Wraithlords can do a lot of damage in close combat as well. And I actually have another Eldar player in our local group who plays Uthway, and I've mentioned him a couple of times on the channel, but he has been playing Uthway since the beginning, since he got his army in 3rd edition, and he's been a hardcore Uthway fan ever since, even when they just were only different by paint scheme, right? And they didn't have any special rules. So we were actually talking, and we used to run a couple of Wraithlords back in 4th edition because they were just so good back then. And I think they're kind of in a great place now. And he was actually telling me that the current state of the Wraithlord reminds him a lot of those good old days of 4th edition when Wraithlords could just basically stomp through everything. And basically they feel really quite immune to things like Strength 4. I mean, except if you're firing them in massive amounts, Strength 4 weapons really just don't do much against them at all, right? So if someone's firing bolters at them or something like that, Wraithlords can just laugh them off really easily. And they just really feel much better now than they have in the past. So I do think Wraithlords can be strong. I think they're very competitive, or can be, but they just need a certain type of list to bring out their strengths. So when should you run a Wraithlord in your list? So you may be thinking, well, where is the opportunity to run one of these? And I think when your build needs a tough unit that can secure the backfield, perform multiple roles as well while doing it, and push middle objectives in the late game, I think that's the kind of list that would really benefit from a Wraithlord. So one type of list comes to mind, and that's Uthway, obviously, because they're very defensive and they usually push objectives in the late game anyway. So I think Wraithlords in those types of defensive lists can be extremely effective. And also, not for nothing, I do think they can be kind of useful in a Hail of Doom list when you do need something strong in the backfield. So again, Hail of Doom, a lot of people think it's just spamming Dire Avengers or whatever, but you do also need other units, right? You do need units to cover the weaknesses of your Dire Avengers. And a unit that does that really well is the Wraithlord, because Dire Avengers are not good in close combat. They're not known for being exceptionally tough, and they sometimes do require an anchor to hold them in place and to screen out enemy units. So that's definitely going to be the Wraithlord in those lists. All right, so in conclusion, despite their distinct absence from ultra-competitive lists in tournaments, I do think Wraithlords serve a very distinct role in a Craftworld army. And that's basically just being able to secure the backfield and being a strong presence as a defensive tool. And again, something that can bully the battlefield in the late game as well. Because in the late game, when not much is left alive, again, we are playing Craftworld Eldar, we do play for the late game oftentimes. Having something tough and sticky that you don't have to spend a bunch of points on that can also perform other roles is really good, right? And they're especially good in defensive builds where, again, their mixed role can be taken advantage of. You know, and a lot of people discount Wraithlords because of that mixed role. They say, well, it's more efficient just to go, you know, if I want melee damage, I'm just going to go Howling Banshees. Or if I just want range damage, I'm going to do Warwalkers, right? And while that is very true, those other units will have more damage potential than the Wraithlord for their points. It's not always about that, right? It's not always about how much damage a unit can do in any particular area, but sometimes about what the unit can do for your army to support the rest of your forces, right? And to be honest with you, Howling Banshees are great, but they don't really support your forces too well sometimes, right? Sometimes they're just used as kind of a bullet to go hard after something and take it out quickly. And although that is very needed in a lot of Craftworld Eldar lists, we do need units like that to take out big threats. Sometimes you do just need a tanky unit that can peel for you and secure your backfield. And that's the Wraithlord, right? Just like any MOBA game, you know, if we want to make that comparison, the Wraithlord is like your tank. It can peel for your squishy units that are doing all the damage. But just like any tank in any MOBA game, if you throw them out in front of the whole team and expect them to soak all the damage, I'm sorry, but you're going to be wrong, right? You're going to die, right? And that's the same thing with the Wraithlord. You do have to use it smartly. You can't just throw it out in front of the opponent's army and expect it to survive and then, you know, be upset when it dies. Because, you know, Wraithlords are tough, but they're not that tough, right? They're not immune to damage. So even though the Wraithlord might seem like an easy unit to use, it's actually a little bit more difficult than you might think initially. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. See you guys next time. I have a couple more videos coming out later this week. One about how to build an effective Craftworld Eldar list. And I'm also going to look into a couple of your suggestions and go ahead and start videos on those. I do want to do a video covering the Tau and how to fight against Tau, but I haven't had a lot of experience as Edition fighting them because the person in the gaming group who does play Tau really doesn't play them that much and, is mostly focused on other armies now. But I am going to talk to him and see if he wants to get a few games in, maybe later this week or next week, and see if I can get that video out for you guys. Also, my Patreon and PayPal links are going to be in the description. Go ahead and check those out if you want to support the channel further. Thank you so much to all of those who have supported the channel. I really appreciate it, and your support is very welcomed and thanked. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. See you guys later. Peace out, and have some good games this weekend. Until next time, everybody, see you later.